Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Chile, an attempt at historic compromise. The real story of the Allende years, by Jorge Palacios. Part 4. The bourgeois institutions confronted by the Allende government. Chapter 9. The opposition by Parliament, the Contraloria, and the courts. Parliament was another bastion of the ruling classes that the popular unity and its government had to confront. Following the parliamentary elections of 1969, the composition of Parliament, at the time Salvador Allende took over the presidency of the Republic, was as follows. Out of a total of 150 members, the opposition had 89, 34 National Party and 55 Christian Democrats. The government controlled 61 members, 24 Radical Party, 15 Socialist Party, and 22 Communist Party. The government was also in the minority in the Senate. Out of a total of 50 senators, it had only 21. In 1971, before the economic crisis made itself felt, the government succeeded in increasing its parliamentary representation by winning the support of some Christian Democratic senators and members of parliament who broke with their party and joined the government forces, followed by a group of party members. In this way, the government came to have 90 representatives out of a total of 200 in the two houses. In 1972, its parliamentary representation dropped again to one-third of the total, as 22 Radical Party representatives went over to the opposition. Finally, in the March 1973 elections, the government received 44% of the vote, thanks to a determined electoral fight that gobbled up tens of millions of dollars, and on the basis of artificially maintaining the fiction of nearly full employment. This was done at the price of aggravating the economic crisis and the budgetary deficit to the utmost. Nevertheless, the government's representation in the two houses fell to 83 representatives, 7 radicals, 7 independents, 35 socialists, and 34 communists. The opposition, on the other hand, although it did not obtain the two-thirds majority that it had its eye on in order to legally impeach President Allende, elected 117 representatives, 69 Christian Democrats, 42 National Party, and 6 Radical Party. Taking advantage of its majority, the opposition systematically and implacably used Parliament, as well as all the other institutions of bourgeois rule that it controlled, as instruments to obstruct all the government's plans. It used and interpreted to its convenience the prerogatives of Parliament and the existing laws in order to intensify the economic crisis, to prevent the government from finding a legal way out of its problems, and to discredit it with a view of overthrowing it. Thus, the opposition spoke constantly, and with the most thorough cynicism, of the so-called illegal acts of a government that was completely attached to legalism, while at the same time it backed all sorts of illegal activities conducive to its overthrow. Employer strikes, sabotage, arms trafficking, assassinations, the hoarding of products, and, as the culmination of all this, the execution of the fascist coup d'etat, which completely cancelled all the legal guarantees in the name of which it was supposedly fighting the popular unity government. It really was a disgusting spectacle to see all the bourgeois politicians speak in emphatic and solemn tones of the necessity of respecting the law and the Constitution, which they alone were violating, while they feverishly prepared the advent of the fascist hangmen who would establish as a system of government, with the complicity of these bourgeois politicians and in their filthy interests, torture, massacres, imprisonment, and the abolition of all legal and constitutional guarantees. 1. Parliamentary obstruction. One of the procedures, perhaps the least injurious, used by the opposition majority in Parliament to combat the government, was the launching of bills designed to restrict the traditional prerogatives of the executive, or other propositions which forced the government to use its right of veto. This right consisted in the ability of the President of the Republic to cancel, add to, or modify certain aspects of laws approved by a simple majority in Parliament. To overrule the veto, Parliament had to obtain a two-thirds majority on the original proposition. If a two-thirds vote was not obtained, the President's decision stood. Although the opposition knew in advance that the executive would veto propositions that were reactionary or contrary to its policy, it forced it to use its right of veto. This served the opposition's propaganda, which pictured the government as being against the legislative work of Parliament, as fighting against the so-called civic majority represented by the parliamentary majority. On August 20, 1971, for example, the government was forced to veto a bill from the Chamber of Deputies by means of which the opposition intended to deprive the President of the Republic of his power to determine the characteristics of the coin and banknotes printed in Chile. In September 1971, the government had to veto an opposition bill which would set up national television networks at the expense of the public treasury, with the goal of extending the influence of one of the opposition's most powerful means of anti-government propaganda, Channel 13 television, throughout the country. Presented as an attack on freedom of expression, the veto against this bill was intensively used by the opposition during the entire term of the Allende government to develop protests by students and other sections of the population. With respect to bills proposed to Parliament by the executive, the opposition's tactic was to oppose their inclusion on the agenda, to indefinitely postpone voting on them by means of delaying tactics, or to completely change their content during the article-by-article discussion. Thus, for example, the budgetary bills were systematically modified as to their financing. Every time the government tried to fight inflation in financing the budget and to readjust wages and salaries by taxing the highest paid groups, the parliamentary majority passed these bills with inflationary financing based on taxation of everyday consumer goods. In this way, executive proposals, contained in budgetary or other bills, increasing taxes on the richest groups and on luxury goods, were cancelled. Parliament also rejected a law against tax fraud, which in 1971 was greater than the total budgetary deficit for the same year. On another occasion, the budget of the state railway was cut, fitting in with the employers' strikes aimed at sabotaging transportation. Funds for literacy work were withdrawn, and the budget of the Production Development Corporation, Corfo, a key organization for economic development in the public sector, was cut by 2 billion escudos. In June 1971, a government budgetary provision for the hiring of 1,000 uniformed carabineros was rejected. The pretext used was that the government had to first dissolve and disarm the armed groups, acting outside the Constitution. Thus, the executive's timid attempts to get reliable men into the police force through the hiring failed. The list of the various forms of obstruction against all the propositions tabled in Parliament by the government would be lengthy. This obstruction went to the extent of refusing to authorize ministers to travel abroad. Here, we will merely cite some of the main bills rejected in Parliament by the opposition majority or changed in their essential content. It is not necessary to refer again to the bill against economic crime, mentioned in an earlier chapter, which was substantially changed into an anti-government bill, its original purpose having been completely transformed. On the other hand, there was the executive bill designed to reform the political constitution in order to create a unicameral parliament. The executive never even succeeded in having it voted on. A bill presented in December 1971 aimed at regulating the distribution of papers to newspapers by creating a national paper institute met the same fate. In addition, the government's educational reform plan, called the National Unified School Bill, was so furiously attacked by the opposition circles, not only through their propaganda instruments, but also through mass street demonstrations of anti-government students, parents' associations, and teachers, that the government was forced to completely bury it. Although the government backed down on this reform, the issue was used until the collapse of the government to bring large numbers of people in the field of education into the corporate and employers' movements to overthrow it. Lastly, a conciliatory bill which was presented by the CP leader and Minister of the Economy, Orlando Millas, without consulting the other popular unity parties, a bill considerably reducing the number of firms to be incorporated into the social sector of the economy, was also rejected by Parliament. All this blind and rigid obstruction in Parliament exposed the illusions of those who believed in the lies spread by the CP leaders that it was possible to take advantage of these bourgeois institutions to advance towards socialism rather than destroying them as Marxism teaches. In no way was Parliament playing its accustomed role as a place where the interests of various sections of the bourgeoisie were harmonized and conciliated in a fairly flexible manner. Because the plan for state capitalism disguised as socialism, advocated by the popular unity, threatened the interests of the most reactionary groups, which were in control of power, Parliament became a brick wall, indeed a war machine against all the government's initiatives. In this stubborn and implacable opposition, it did not matter that the government measures were for the people or were designed to alleviate the acute economic crisis. It did not matter that these initiatives coincided with some points in the electoral programs of the opposition parties. Only the goal of demolishing, obstructing, and condemning any solution to failure was taken into account, for this was necessary in order to overthrow the government. Two, constitutional indictments. Another method used by the opposition parliamentary majority to discredit the Allende government and upset the implementation of its plans was that of constitutional indictments against ministers of state and other trusted officials of the executive. The opposition took advantage of the power given the Chamber of Deputies by Article 39 of the Constitution to, quote, declare to be founded or unfounded indictments drawn up by at least 10 of its members against the following officials: A. The President of the Republic, B. Ministers of State, for the offenses of treason, extortion, abuse of power, misappropriation of public funds, corruption, infraction of the Constitution, violation of the laws, failure to apply the laws, and grave breach of the security and honor of the nation, unquote. If the indictments were approved, the Chamber had the prerogative of suspending the minister in question, after which the Senate had the power of removing him from office. These powers could be exercised independently of subsequent action by the courts against the accused. This procedure had the additional advantage of being not a complex system of indictment such as the one used by the courts, but a mere judgment, in their soul and conscience, by the members of Parliament as to the infraction of Article 39 of the Constitution, a judgment made by a simple majority vote. The only reason the procedure was not used to impeach the President of the Republic was that in his case a 2/3 vote was required, something the opposition could never put together. The procedure of constitutional indictments, extremely unusual in Chilean political practice, it was used only on rare occasions after the 1925 Constitution, became a powerful weapon against the Allende government. The indictments became progressively more numerous, in full coordination with the development of the legal and illegal offensive aimed at overthrowing the government. It was a question not only of hindering any stable and coherent government policy, but also of showing clearly, alongside the like-minded activity of the Contraloria and the courts, who really controlled power in Chile. This trial of strength was of decisive importance in showing the extreme weakness and lack of real power on which the popular unity experiment was based, and in encouraging the hesitant middle sections to unite with the subversive opposition led by the most reactionary forces, which they did. The constitutional indictments began with the one presented on February 2, 1971, by the National Party against the Minister of Justice, Lisandro Cruz Ponce, alleging that certain amnesties granted to leftists imprisoned by the previous government were illegal and unconstitutional. This indictment failed because the Christian Democrats abstained from voting, maintaining that these amnesties came under the sole responsibility of the President of the Republic. Later, on March 10, the National Party presented another charge, this time against the labor minister Jose Ollarse, quote, for abuse of power and violation of constitutional order, end quote. Ollarse had invoked the legal loopholes mentioned above to name administrators for certain factories. This charge also failed. However, on May 12, the intendant of Colchagua province was relieved of his duties for abuse of power. The pretext was the accidental death of a landlord who suffered a heart attack when his lands were expropriated. The National Party, still alone in taking these initiatives, launched a constitutional indictment on September 8, 1971, against the Minister of the Economy, Pedro Vuskovic, for, quote, abuse of power, violation of the laws, and failure to apply the laws, end quote. As examples of these so-called violations of the law, which in reality were examples of the arbitrary class interpretation which the reactionaries put on the law, the National Party named the nationalization of the banks by direct purchase of their shares and requisitioning of enterprises. This charge against Vuskovic, which failed for want of support by Christian Democrats, was reiterated in December 1971 by the National Party, the hardest hit by the expropriations. In December 1971, when the first symptoms of economic crisis under the Popular Unity administration made themselves felt, the Christian Democrats abandoned their previous position of abstaining on constitutional indictments. On December 2, 1971, it was the CDP that presented an indictment against Interior Minister Jose Toja, under the pretext that he was responsible for not having dissolved what were alleged to be armed groups affiliated with the government. These groups, according to the CDP, had assaulted participants in a demonstration organized by the opposition to protest against shortages. As might have been expected, the National Party joined in this charge on the following day. Finally, with the support of the CDP, this method of opposition initiated by the National Party won out, obtaining the majority vote in Parliament necessary to make the charges stick. Thus, on January 6, 1972, the Chamber of Deputies approved the indictment against Toja by 80 votes to 59. Toja was immediately suspended from his duties under Article 39 of the Constitution, as interpreted, of course, according to the interests of the rightist opposition. On January 22, the Senate brought the procedure of constitutional indictment to its culmination, removing the Minister of the Interior from office for so-called, quote, infractions of the Constitution, violation of the laws, failure to apply the laws, and a grave breach of security for the nation, end quote. On January 3, a spontaneous mass demonstration was held outside the presidential palace in protest against the suspension of Toja. The participants in the demonstration wanted to march on Parliament and take it. The President of the Republic calmed them down, declaring, quote, our strength is political consciousness. When the time comes for the people to adopt a different attitude, I will be the one to give the call and to take on all the responsibility, end quote. However, as we know, this call never came. The only calls that were heard were for conciliation, always aimed at holding back the fighting spirit of the people. In the end, President Allende only responded to the dismissal of his minister with another equally artificial maneuver, naming him Minister of National Defense in a timid attempt to salvage the government's prestige. The weakness of the official response allowed the opposition to turn its tactic of bringing down government ministers into a real sport, like a game of bowling. On June 21, 1972, a commission of inquiry, named by the Chamber of Deputies in regard to a few pieces of baggage sent from Cuba that did not go through customs, charged the new Minister of the Interior, Hernan del Canto, with offenses and irregularities. On June 23, the National Party laid a constitutional charge against Del Canto, adding on the accusation of, quote, responsibility in common law offenses of smuggling and tax fraud, end quote, and of, quote, failure to apply the provisions for public order in the face of the illegal occupations, end quote. The document mentioned the occupation of land by the peasants and of factories by workers in labor disputes. In other words, this indictment was designed to clearly establish the government's obligation to repress any mass movement considered a threat to the interests of the ruling classes. On July 5, 1972, the Chamber of Deputies approved the charges against the Interior Minister for, quote, having gravely compromised the security of the nation, infringed the political constitution of the state, violated the laws, failed to apply the laws, and gravely abused his power, end quote. On July 27, with the ratification of the indictment by Senate, Del Canto was removed from office. As can be seen, the essence of the charge was that he had not used the legal system to repress the people, a legal system designed to defend the interests of those who own the means of production. Thus, the very policy of the government was labeled illegal to the extent that it did not repress certain forms of people's struggle. In this way, the Popular Unity government began to confront not only a number of institutions of bourgeois rule controlled by the most reactionary strata, but also a legislative system created to serve the interests of these strata. President Allende faced the dismissal of another of his ministers by transferring him to the position of Secretary General of the government. President Allende faced the dismissal of another of his ministers by transferring him to the position of Secretary General of the government. In the same stride, and as part of the changes against the Interior Minister, the Senate discharged the Intendant of Santiago from his post at the request of a special investigator appointed by the Court of Appeal, for having failed to repress the occupation of the court by Melipilla, a district near Santiago, by a group of peasants protesting against the arbitrary actions of the judge of the court. Shouting, quote, "Judges, sellouts, thieves, corrupt," end quote, a crowd of workers and peasants assembled opposite the parliament and court buildings to protest the dismissal of the intendant and the Minister of the Interior. Fully expressing the sentiment of the people, a peasant leader said, quote, "We have to unite to destroy the bastion of the momios, the parliament, and the bourgeois justice. To the swine in parliament, with the respect due to swine, comrades, we say that they will be held accountable to the people for everything they do against us," end quote. The President of the Supreme Court, Enrique Urrutia Manzano, sent a protest to the President of the Republic regarding the demonstration held in front of the courts, and the latter replied by assuring him that such actions would not be repeated. Urrutia Manzano nonetheless insisted to the President, quote, "Your Excellency states that Mr. President has forbidden the holding of public demonstrations in the area where this one took place, and in some cases has given the order that the workers not parade in these places. This court is gratified that such is the case, but our satisfaction would be greater if the orders of Mr. President had actually been implemented in the specific case which concerns us. We hope," end quote, he warned in conclusion, quote, "that in future there can be no infringement of orders coming from such a high place, even if such infringement is spontaneous or by surprise," end quote. Urrutia Manzano and his confederates in what the peasant leader justly called the bastion of the momios, the Supreme Court, made maximum use of this court to block any reform affecting reactionary interests and to offer judicial protection with impunity to fascist saboteurs and assassins. All this was done, of course, in the name of so-called sacrosanct respect for the existing laws. Their real respect for the Constitution and the law was demonstrated after the coup d'etat. They unconstitutionally upheld all the arbitrary, illegal, and unconstitutional measures of the military junta. Urrutia Manzano exposed the real motives for all their actions when, immediately after the coup d'etat, he had the supreme impudence to demand that the military restore him to his 2 large expropriated estates. He went by helicopter to take charge of his former properties as payment for his services. In August 1972, the National Party tried to use nothing less than the agricultural crisis as cause for a constitutional indictment against the minister concerned. This charge did not succeed at that time because of its crude pretext, but it was successfully repeated later on as part of a collective indictment against several ministers. However, in mid-October, as though not to lose the initiative, the opposition charged the intendant of Biobío province, under the Constitution, for having ordered the temporary closing of a radio station that was encouraging its listeners to join the illegal strike in transportation, commerce, and other corporations, a strike being waged that month by the opposition with the express aim of overthrowing the government. The pretext for this charge was offered to Parliament by the Contraloria, which ruled that this order to close did not conform to the law. On October 25, the intendant of Biobío was removed from office. It is obvious that Parliament, the Contraloria, and the courts joined forces, raising 101 legal quibbles to prevent the government from using the existing laws to defend itself, while they themselves actively used this legal system to serve their subversive plans to overthrow the government. On the day the intendant of Biobío was removed from office, the Chamber of Deputies passed a resolution of protest because the government had forced the radio transmitters to broadcast a national program dealing with the opposition strike. Quote, the government, end quote, the resolution stated, quote, has constantly and repeatedly violated the provisions of the Constitution, even in matters so fundamental to a democracy as freedom of expression, thus placing itself outside the law. Such a situation of illegality alters and upsets the rule of law, compromises the security of the nation, and threatens the social peace, end quote. It would be difficult to imagine a more cynical and hypocritical statement. The opposition was invoking the Constitution, the laws, the rule of law, and social peace to protest against a few timid measures, quite usual under all previous governments, which were designed to head off an openly subversive, putschist movement, a movement aimed, as events have shown, at completely destroying the entire legal and constitutional system. On October 28, during the employers' strike, the opposition, united in the so-called Democratic Confederation, GODE, decided to indict under the Constitution no less than 4 ministers: the ministers of the economy, of the interior, of agriculture, and of education. The impeachment of these ministers was not carried through because the whole cabinet resigned on October 31. The opposition did not stop there, however, and on November 2, the Senate removed the intendant of Santiago from office for the alleged offenses of, quote, arbitrary detainment, prohibiting a demonstration, and threatening to occupy certain districts of Santiago, end quote. The year 1972 closed with a constitutional indictment presented on December 13 by the National Party and the Radical Democratic Party against the Minister of Finance and member of the CP Secretariat, Orlando Millas. He was accused of having taken reprisals against participants in the October 1972 strike. On December 28, which is celebrated as Holy Innocents' Day in Chile, the Chamber of Deputies suspended Millas from his duties by a vote of 75 to 42. President Allende, castling, as usual when faced with constitutional indictments, named Millas Minister of the Economy and Fernando Flores, leader of MAPU, Minister of Finance. On January 10, the Senate ratified the constitutional charge against Orlando Millas, but his dismissal was inapplicable because he had been relieved of his duties as Minister of Finance. On March 28, 1973, it was the Christian Democrats' turn to present a constitutional indictment against the new intendant of Santiago, Jaime Faivovich, quote, for failure to fulfill his obligations to maintain the peace and public order, end quote. But the peace and public order were being disturbed basically by the fascist armed groups and by opposition students. On April 15, the Chamber of Deputies suspended Faivovich, and 10 days later, the Senate removed him from office by a vote of 28 to 0. The government members no longer participated in debate on the indictments, since their arguments counted for nothing, the opposition's majority voting machine being the only factor at work. On June 7, the Christian Democratic Party presented another constitutional indictment against Orlando Millas, this time as Minister of the Economy, quote, for unconstitutionally granting powers to the Boards of Supply and Prices, JAPs, end quote. Millas, incidentally, was one of the champions in the CP leadership of the theory that it was possible to build socialism in Chile using the laws and institutions of the bourgeois society. On July 5, the Senate removed him from office. But that was not all. In May 1973, the opposition unleashed another offensive of strikes and violence designed to overthrow the government. The opposition's plan to disrupt the functioning of the government by impeaching minister after minister was part of this offensive. Thus, alongside the constitutional indictment against Millas, the Christian Democrats laid charges against the ministers of Labor and of Mines on May 24. Furthermore, as though all this was not enough, the National Party and CDP members presented a constitutional indictment on the same day against Interior Minister Gerardo Espinosa for having authorized a search of the Channel 6 television station of the University of Chile. On July 3, he was suspended by the Chamber of Deputies. On August 2, the ministerial impeachment offensive continued in full coordination with the general offensive, which 1 month later would overthrow the government. The Minister of the Interior, Carlos Briones, was indicted under the Constitution. The pretext this time was the poor treatment which some had allegedly inflicted on certain opposition members of parliament by some carabineros. Finally, on September 4, 1973, only 1 week before the coup d'etat, the Christian Democratic Party presented a constitutional indictment against all the ministers of state, holding them responsible for not having put an end, quote, to the unconstitutional and illegal acts, end quote, of which the opposition majority in the Chamber of Deputies had accused the government. The sole purpose of this indictment was to supply Pinochet and his fascist clique with a legal excuse to carry out the coup d'etat. 3. The Christian Democrats' constitutional reform. Because of the decisive role it played as legal cover for the coup d'etat, we have left to last our analysis of the plan for constitutional reform of the 3 economic sectors, public, mixed, and private, which was put forward by Christian Democratic Senators Hamilton and Fuentealba. In fact, the constitutional reform bill was supposed to be a veritable act of surrender imposed on the popular unity and its government. The bill transferred to Parliament, that is, to the opposition majority, the power to decide which companies could be incorporated into the public or mixed partnership of state and private capital sectors of the economy, and which had to remain in the private sector. This was supposing that the parliamentary majority was in the mood to enlarge the public and mixed sectors at all, for the bill was an obstacle that the opposition put in the way of any nationalization or transfer to the mixed sector of a private company. Moreover, the methods the executive used to oppose this reform bill led to a serious jurisdictional conflict between the executive and parliament, the Contraloria and the Constitutional Court. This conflict was to serve as a pretext to declare the government illegal and illegitimate, and to justify openly calling on the armed forces to overthrow it. The Constitutional Reform Bill was introduced on October 20, 1971, and approved by Congress in plenary session on February 19, 1972. In essence, the bill changed Article 10 of the Political Constitution, which guaranteed the right of property and established the procedure for nationalization of an asset in cases where it was considered to be in the public interest. According to this article of the Constitution, no one could be deprived of his property except by virtue of a law and with compensation. But the article left the government the power to decide in each case, in accordance with the development of the country, the question of which assets, companies, or means of distribution, production, or financing it considered appropriate to expropriate for reasons of public interest. Although such nationalization ultimately depended on the passage of a law, that is, on a parliamentary majority. The Christian Democrats' constitutional reform, however, was intended to freeze the procedures for nationalization once and for all. It required that a definition be given in law of the assets and means of production which would be possible to bring into the social sector of the economy and make state property, and of those assets which would constitute the mixed sector and be the joint property of the state and private owners. The rest would remain in the private sector. Furthermore, taking away the ability of the state to nationalize private companies by buying their shares, the bill established that it was only through legislation that the state, municipalities, and public sector bodies and companies could be authorized to purchase shares or titles belonging to private pensions in order to nationalize their assets or means. Thus, even with respect to the companies defined by law under the reform as liable to be transferred into the state sector, the opposition blocked the procedure that the government had used to nationalize companies, that of buying their shares through financial bodies such as Corfo. With this provision, not only did opposition annul the procedure that Corfo had used under different governments since its founding, but it also deprived the executive of a right that every citizen in Chile enjoyed. What is more, once the state sector was defined, the approval of the opposition would be necessary for the transfer of each company, since the passage of a law, dependent on the majority in parliament, was required. In another point, the reform abolished all provisions which directly or indirectly allowed for the nationalization of distribution, financial, or other enterprises, assets, or means of production. This was an attempt to void the government's application of what were called the legal loopholes to control certain companies by requisition or takeover. These loopholes had been furnished by the old Decree/Law 520 from 1932, which authorized the government to act if, for various reasons, a company was unable to supply the market. Lastly, the Hamilton Fuente Alba reform retroactively annulled the nationalization that the government had carried out by buying shares over a period of nearly 6 months. It declared, quote, void and without effect the acts or agreements carried out or honored by the state or by the bodies or entities which make up the state or which are under its control or dependent on it from October 14, 1971 onward, to buy shares or bonds from private persons for the purpose of nationalizing or bringing under state control goods or service-producing companies, without the express authorization of a law enacted in accordance with the stipulations of paragraph 16 of Article 44 of the Political Constitution of the State." End quote. This provision voided the nationalization of the cement monopolies, the numerous textile firms, the banks, and many other companies that had been brought into the state sector through the purchase of shares. Not only did this violate the right already exercised by the executive of buying shares in a company on the same terms as any citizen, but it also violated the right of the shareholders who had agreed to sell the state their shares. In sum, we can say that this constitutional reform not only struck at the heart of the plans for the development of state capitalism that the Popular Unity and its government were making and implementing, but also represented a declared return from the presidential system to the parliamentary system, which had long ago been abolished in Chile. From this point of view, the reform would act as a real provocation by taking away a number of exclusive prerogatives of the executive. Its acceptance by the government would have meant unconditional surrender. Apparently, therefore, the opposition was expecting the executive to reject it. Given the ambiguity of the provisions of the Constitution as to the quorum required for Parliament to override an executive veto, the rejection of the reform by the executive would then lead to a confrontation between Parliament and the government, which is just what happened. This gave the opposition the opportunity to accuse the executive of violating the Constitution. While the 1925 Constitution expressly required a two-thirds majority in Parliament to override a veto, the constitutional reform approved in January 1970 left the necessary proportion ambiguous. The opposition used this as grounds to maintain that, since the Constitution did not expressly require a two-thirds vote to override the veto of the original reform bill, quote, it must be understood, end quote, that a simple majority was enough. Amongst other arguments it gave in maintaining that a two-thirds majority was necessary, the government pointed to Article 108 of the Constitution, which stated in its first paragraph that, quote, the reform of provisions of the Constitution will be governed by the same rules as a bill, end quote, these rules requiring a two-thirds majority in Parliament to cancel an executive veto. However, it would be useless to try to determine whether the government or the opposition was in the right in this polemic on constitutional law, since the essence of the struggle clearly did not lie for either side in a problem of legal purism. What counted was the struggle for power, a confrontation between classes, and the legal arguments were only a pretext. The proof of this was that none of the opposition's pure experts in legal matters agreed with the government's thesis, and none of the government's experts shared the opinion of its opponents. The interpretation of this problem depended on concrete political interests. The other way out remaining to the government under the Constitution in case of disagreement between the executive and parliament on constitutional reform was to call a referendum, so that the citizens could decide the disputed points. However, when this possibility actually came up in 1972, 22 Radical Party members of parliament who had supported the government had just gone over to the opposition, precisely because of the government's veto of the constitutional reform bill, thus reducing the government's representation in parliament to 1/3 of the total. Because of this, the government, which was already on the defensive on many fronts, became even more fearful of defeat in a referendum, which it judged would be even worse than a defeat in parliament. Incidentally, this refusal of the executive to resort to a referendum in a matter concerning one of the most fundamental aspects of the government's program confirms our thesis on the weak base of support it had in its control of power and its resulting growing isolation from the masses, and in particular from the middle strata. On February 21, President Allende declared, quote, "By virtue of the power conferred on me by the Constitution, I propose to Congress that it delete or alter all the provisions of the bill which entail denial of the prerogatives that no one has ever previously attempted to deny the executive power." End quote. At the same time, he rejected the idea of calling a referendum and declared that he would resort to the arbitration of the Constitutional Court. The next day, the opposition members of Parliament rejected the idea that the Constitutional Court should solve a dispute between the majority in Parliament and the government, for this would imply recognition of a superior authority over and above the three branches of state power. On April 6, 1972, the two ministers of the Radical Left Party, RLP, resigned, and its members of Parliament went over to the opposition. The president of the RLP, Luis Bosay, said, quote, "The problem of interpreting the Constitution arising out of the veto of this kind of bill, referring to the CDP constitutional reform, has resulted in a jurisdictional conflict with unforeseeable consequences." End quote. Showing his agreement with the reform, he added, if the veto, quote, "was approved as it stands, this would mean that the small and middle producers would continue to be put in a position of total uncertainty and insecurity." End quote. Of course, the jurisdictional conflict that he saw coming had very foreseeable consequences for this sector, and he wanted to join the reactionary opposition camp while there was time. In June, President Allende began discussions with the Christian Democratic Party leadership with a view to reaching an agreement on the delimitation of the three sectors of the economy, and thus avoiding the conflict that was looming. However, the only effect of the discussions was a 2-week postponement of the vote in Parliament, which was to reject the presidential vetoes of the reform bill. The discussions broke off at the end of June without reaching agreement on which enterprises would be amalgamated into the social sector, nor the executive prerogatives that were taken away in the reform bill. The truth is that the President of the Republic, trusting in the constitutionalist and apolitical nature of the Army High Command, a trust promoted by the CP leaders, still believed that he could count on enough room to maneuver to refuse a compromise with the Christian Democrats. Such a compromise would have meant giving up a number of aspects of the development of state capitalism, or sharing it with the CDP. At the beginning of July, the executive vetoes were overturned by Parliament. On October 1972, the merchants, transport corporations, liberal professions, and others who were staging a strike designed to overthrow the government included in the demands they presented to the government the full promulgation of the constitutional reform, or, failing this, the calling of a referendum. In May 1973, President Allende stated in a speech broadcast on the radio, quote, "I am speaking to the country to inform you that yesterday I requested the involvement of the Constitutional Court. I asked it for a judgment on the position of Congress regarding the vetoes I had used against the bill drawn up by 2 members of Parliament to change the Constitution. Congress's move is an obstacle to the formation of the social sector and consolidates the capitalist system. The procedure followed by the present majority in the 2 houses holds a serious threat to the very essence of our institutions. Congress is attempting to ignore the stipulation of the Congress, which establishes that the will of the majority in Congress cannot take precedence over that of the head of state without a 2/3 vote of its members." End quote. President Allende then said clearly, and in this he was completely right, that for the executive to accept a reform of the Constitution that it could only block if it had a parliamentary majority, since its vetoes could be overturned by a simple majority vote, would effectively mean turning over the government of the country to the opposition majority in parliament. And this was obvious, because all the powers of the executive were determined by the political constitution of the state, and could be taken away by constitutional reform. This included the stipulation that a two-thirds majority was needed to impeach and remove the President of the Republic. While denying that the Constitutional Court was qualified to deal with this kind of problem, the opposition stated that to solve this sort of jurisdictional conflict, the executive could call a referendum, which the President of the Republic was refusing to do, quote, because he knows very well that he is governing against the will of the majority of the people, end quote. On May 15, President Allende promulgated those articles of the constitutional reform with which the government agreed, and sent the others, on which there was no agreement with the opposition, to the Constitutional Court. 2 days later, the Senate and Chamber of Deputies, through the opposition majority, declared the Constitutional Court unqualified to pronounce judgment on the disagreements between the executive and Congress on matters of constitutional reform, and gave notice that any decision of this court in the matter would be null, void, and without effect. At the end of May, the Constitutional Court declared itself unqualified to decide on the voting procedure for constitutional reform in Parliament. Previously, the government had stated, quote, in this event, neither of the powers involved in establishing the laws being able to impose its criterion of interpretation of the constitutional norms of procedure for bills reforming the political constitution, it is the sole responsibility of the President of the Republic to promulgate this part of the bill on which there is no disagreement with Congress. That is, to proceed with promulgation, leaving aside the provisions which, although they were vetoed, were not reaffirmed by the two houses of Congress, end quote. In answer to this, the Speaker of the Senate, Eduardo Frei, and the Speaker of the House, Luis Pareto, jointly sent the text of the constitutional reform to the Comptroller General of the Republic, stating that a partial promulgation of the reform, quote, would violate the clear and express provisions of the Constitution, end quote, which established that if the government did not hold a referendum within a specified time, quote, the bill approved by Congress will be promulgated, end quote. However, this argument did not overcome the disagreement, since from the government's point of view, the vetoed part of the bill had not been passed, as the vote to overrule the veto had not won a two-thirds majority. The intransigence of the two sides in interpreting the powers of Congress and the executive, the two branches in which the opposition and the government respectively had concentrated the formal aspect of their struggle, moved the conflict onto the ground where power struggles are always settled in the last resort, onto the ground of force. This was just what the opposition wanted, because it was ready to settle the issue in its favor on this ground. On the other side, the government and the coalition supporting it were materially, politically, and ideologically disarmed by the opportunist, pacifist, and legalist sermons of the CP leaders, and continued to embroil itself in useless legal arguments, to foster hope that the army would not take sides in the oncoming confrontation, and indeed would prevent it, and to believe in a negotiated solution to the conflict. The demands of the opposition, however, always were more in the nature of an ultimatum based on force. The president of the Christian Democratic Party, Patricio Aylwin, stated in June 1973 that, quote, if President Allende is seeking social peace and wants to avoid civil war, he has the means to do so, to go to the people in the democratic manner to clear up the questions at issue, end quote. The basis of these threats was obviously not that the Christian Democrats or their allies in the opposition were prepared as civilian political forces to lead a civil war against the government, but that they were assured of the support of those who gave the orders to those who had the guns, the armed forces. Thus, the traitorous, tearful slogan given at that time by the CP leaders, "No to civil war," neither moved nor frightened the civilian political forces of the opposition, who had men ready to take up arms for them, if only demobilized, and tried to frighten the people, who could have fought against the military coup d'etat. On June 6, 1973, the constitutional time limit for the government to call a referendum expired. The final opposition offensive had already been unleashed, through strikes, sabotage, violence, street demonstrations, and finally, at the end of June, an attempted coup d'etat by a tank regiment. On July 2, the Contraloria made its contribution to what served as a pretext to show that the government had violated the Constitution. It rejected the executive's partial promulgation of the constitutional reform. A National Party member of Parliament, Sergio Diaz, declared, quote, "This government is running out of legal loopholes. First, it tried to use the Constitutional Court to keep itself afloat. When that body recognized it was unqualified, the government resorted to the Contraloria, which said that the attempt to partially promulgate the Three Sectors Bill was unconstitutional. The only thing left for it to do is to promulgate the reform completely or to place itself outside the Constitution." End quote. Juan Hamilton, the Christian Democratic senator, went even farther than Diaz, stating on July 5 that, quote, "The government is incurring the charge of failure to apply the Constitution by not having fully promulgated the constitutional amendment as soon as the Contraloria rejected its intention of promulgating it in part." In fact, these were not the first statements tending to prepare public opinion for the removal of the government by the armed forces or for its resignation. There was a sustained campaign. This offensive began in April 1973, after the long summer vacation. Sergio Onofrio Harpa, president of the National Party and an ex-Nazi, fired the first shot by declaring that, quote, "The political immorality of the popular unity has shaken the rule of law in Chile. The time has come for Congress to analyze the consequences of the continual arbitrary, illegal, and anti-democratic conduct of the government, and for it to declare that the latter has irreversibly lost its authority and the legitimacy of its mandate." End quote. 3 days later, Harpa's National Party colleague, Senator Francisco Bulnes, followed suit by stating, quote, "Since the first centuries of the Christian era, jurists have maintained that a government of legitimate origin becomes illegitimate if it continually abuses power, violating the basic norms that it must obey. This is called illegitimate exercise, and unfortunately, it is what is affecting Mr. Allende's government. We, citizens who want to live in a democracy, cannot continue to ignore the illegitimacy of the government or to consider it only academically. Against an illegitimate government which is heading straight toward the abolition of democracy, and moreover is destroying Chile's economic heritage, we are forced to use all means at our disposal that would not lead to a greater evil." End quote. On May 28, the Supreme Court took after the government by declaring, quote, "For the 9th time, this Supreme Court must inform Your Excellency of the illegal attitude of the administrative branch, which is illicitly intervening in judicial affairs, as well as of the obstruction by the carabineros of orders emanating from the criminal court, which, according to the law, the carabineros must execute without hindrance. All of this indicates open, obstinate rebellion against judicial decisions, heedless of the changes which such attitudes or omissions produce in the legal order, which means, moreover, that there is no longer merely a crisis in the rule of law, as we represented to Your Excellency in our previous communication, but an impending or imminent breach in the legal order of the country." End quote. On the same day, the Corps of Generals and Admirals in retirement from national defense sent a letter to the President of the Republic, stating, quote, "If the Constitution is interpreted in a tendentious manner, or it is not respected, the resulting actions would be illegitimate, which would amount to breaking the existing link between the authorities and the armed forces." End quote. Quote, "One can no longer maintain a detached attitude toward events in Chile, all the more so if one has worn the uniform of the homeland, for each must assume his responsibility before severe judgment of history." End quote, the letter concluded. In mid-June, the National Party published a statement in which it maintained that, quote, "Legally and morally, no one is obliged to respect nor to obey a government which is no longer legitimate." End quote. It added, quote, "Those who still believe that Mr. Allende's presidential mandate has not been vitiated by his illegitimate exercise have now final proof that the validity of his mandate has come to an end." The president's refusal to fully promulgate the bill on the three sectors of the economy. Mr. Allende has deliberately and systematically violated his solemn promise to respect and apply the Constitution and the laws. It was this promise that enabled him to be elected President of Chile by the majority in the National Congress. End quote. The government replied to the National Party statement, which was published under the title, Mr. Allende is no longer the constitutional president of Chile, by declaring that such a statement, quote, constituted criminal subversion, end quote, and by ordering ministers, deputy ministers, and intendants not to grant hearings to representatives of this party, as a response to such a seditious attitude. The Christian Democratic Party maintained a slightly more cautious attitude at this time, even hoping for a government surrender in its favor. This political nuance was reflected in the agreement reached on July 12 by the Chamber of Deputies, which stated, quote, whereas His Excellency the President of the Republic has given the order to occupy the factories in order to defend the government, and this order has been carried out by the Popular Unity parties, faced with this position of open illegality in which the President of the Republic himself and all the members and parties of the government have put themselves, the Chamber of Deputies resolves to remind His Excellency the President of the Republic that he is putting himself in a position of open illegality, and that his attitude is leading the country to the brink of armed conflict. End quote. This order to occupy the factories was given because of the spread of another strike of the employers and certain professional corporations in the framework of the final offensive to facilitate the military coup d'etat. As a reproach to the weakness of the Christian Democrats' position, Senator Bulnes of the National Party maintained that, quote, toward a government that has fallen into unquestionable illegitimate exercise, we, members of the Parliament, cannot just gather up the legislative crumbs that the executive throws at us, while behind our backs it deals with very serious matters that should be the subject of legislation, and violates the provisions of the law and the Constitution on a daily basis. If we do not adopt in time all the positions that the Constitution and the law authorize to us, we will be as guilty as those who are impelling this process forward. End quote. However, on August 14, 1973, the Christian Democrats insisted only on denouncing the so-called illegality of the government's action. They stated, quote, the Popular Unity government is maintaining a position of illegality and open violation of the political constitution by not promulgating the reform approved by Congress that requires the formation of the social sector to be subject to legislation. End quote. On August 23, the Chamber of Deputies made another decision, one which openly incited the armed forces to stage a coup d'etat. The commanders-in-chief of the armed forces were part of the cabinet, President Allende having forced them to participate in it in order to head off the final offensive of strikes, sabotage, and violence aimed at overthrowing the government. The chamber decided to point out to the ministers from the armed forces and the carabineros that, quote, in the face of the serious disturbance of the constitutional and legal order of the Republic, end quote, it was not suitable for them to endorse a partisan policy through their presidents in the cabinet. The resolution of the majority in Parliament stated that the presence of ministers from the military and the government seriously compromised the professional character of the armed forces and the carabineros, quote, openly infringing the provisions of Article 22 of the Political Constitution and seriously harming their prestige as an institution, end quote. On the eve of the coup d'etat, there appeared many statements from corporations controlled by the opposition forces, such as the College of Physicians, the College of Lawyers, the Federation of Students of the Catholic University, etc., declaring the government to be illegal and demanding its resignation. As is apparent from all that we have explained, Chile's institutionalist and legalist tradition, far from allowing reforms affecting the interests of the ruling circles to be made through the legal, peaceful, and institutional road, as the phony communists proclaimed, at most merely made the arch-reactionary circles feel obliged to dress up their subversive plans for coup in hypocritical legal pretexts. This tradition probably also made the repression more brutal and the elimination of all legal guarantees more complete, for it was necessary to radically extirpate the habits of legality, institutionality, and exercise of certain democratic freedoms in order to establish fascist dictatorship. In this manner, class interests wiped out this superstructure about which revisionism propagated so many illusions. With the stroke of a pen, they obliterated the originality and exceptional character of the Chilean process, the England of Latin America, on which the CP leaders based their anti-Marxist theories. Once again, practice was to confirm Lenin's words. Quote, The very idea of the capitalists peacefully submitting to the will of the majority of the exploited, the very idea of a peaceful, reformist transition to socialism, is not merely sheer Philistine stupidity, but also downright deception of the workers, embellishment of capitalist wage slavery, and concealment of the truth. The truth consists in the bourgeoisie, even the most enlightened and democratic, no longer hesitating at any fraud or crime, even the massacre of millions of workers and peasants, so as to preserve private ownership of the means of production. End quote. This also happened with the experiment of the popular unity and its government, even though their expropriation of the big bourgeoisie and of certain imperialist monopolies was intended only to develop state capitalism and not genuine socialism. All the more reason why the people must prepare to actually seize power for themselves. Four, the government's guerrilla warfare against the Contraloria and the courts. As we have already pointed out, management of the companies that had been confiscated or controlled by means of the legal loopholes was perpetually being disputed by their owners. In this, the owners could count on the unqualified support of the Contraloria, which was responsible for watching over the legality of the government's decisions, and on the complicity of the courts. These two bodies, which showed their legalist zeal for everything that would hinder the government's plans, are today clearly revealing both their reactionary class nature and the hypocrisy of their former pretension of defending the existing institutions and laws. They have accepted all the illegal, arbitrary, anti-constitutional, and genocidal acts of the military junta, and have openly collaborated with it. But they are not the only guilty ones. Also guilty are those who called themselves Marxists and who promoted respect for the institutions of bourgeois rule and for the armed forces, preventing the people from destroying these layers of the most reactionary forces. To get around the opposition of the Contraloria, the government continually had to resort to a measure that the Constitution enabled it to take in urgent and exceptional cases: the decree of insistence, which had to be signed by the President of the Republic and all his ministers. In addition to the obstruction and interference of the Contraloria, designed to intensify the administrative crisis in the public sector, there was the systematic rejection of the decisions of the executive by the courts. In this manner, the management of enterprises confiscated or taken over was continually hindered. The executive was shown before public opinion to be governing outside the law, and the constitutional indictments presented by the majority in Parliament with a view of removing ministers of state for alleged violations of the law or for other reasons were legitimated. All this guerrilla warfare waged against the government by Parliament, the courts, the Contraloria, and other ruling institutions controlled by the opposition finally created the image of an illegitimate government outside the law. When the time came, this image enabled the opposition to replace guerrilla warfare against the government with open war, waged by the army in order to overthrow it through violence. This process, this systematic offensive, like almost all of the experiences of the popular unity government in a wide variety of fields, illustrates the basic thesis of this book: the failure of the peaceful road of the legalist and reformist road to seize power from the ruling circles in Chile. A failure which occurred even though what was at stake was not in the least the building of socialism or a genuine people's anti-imperialist, anti-oligarchic, and anti-monopolist revolution, but merely the replacement of the old system of exploitation by a new one: state capitalism. Let us look at a few examples of this institutional struggle, which was, of course, only one aspect of the many-sided offensive that the opposition unleashed and continually escalated until the overthrow of the government. In June 1971, the Contraloria issued a warning that, quote, "the occupation of a factory, if it constitutes an illegal act, neither authorizes nor makes feasible the requisitioning of the establishment in question." End quote. In the same period, without holding a hearing, the Contraloria rejected the decision of the Industry and Commerce Administration, DIRINCO, to order the requisitioning of the big Manufacturas Yarun textile mills. The following month, without holding a hearing, it rejected DIRINCO's decisions to requisition the Progreso, Panos Oveja Tome, Rayon Said, Lanera Austral, and algodones Irmas textile mills. In August, the Contraloria reaffirmed its judgments, telling Dirinco that, quote, the Contraloria finds it legally necessary to warn you that this is not possible in law to uphold the implementation of the decisions, end quote, bringing the various textile plants under state control. At the end of August, the workers of the national tire industry, INSA, occupied the offices of a factory, declaring that, quote, the Production Development Corporation, Corfo, must take over the company, end quote. On September 3, the government decided to requisition the 9 plants of the United Breweries Company monopoly. Pedro Vuskovic, Minister of the Economy, justified this requisition on the grounds that there was a shortage of beer due to conflicts between the workers and the company. 5 days later, the National Party presented a constitutional indictment against Vuskovic. It accused him of abuse of power, violation of the laws, and failure to apply the laws, and stated that the nationalization of the banks without enabling legislation was contrary to the Constitution, and that the requisitioning of enterprises, quote, is illegal and represents a flagrant violation of the Constitution and existing legislation, end quote. During the debate, a National Party member of Parliament stated, quote, almost all the requisitions ordered to date have been based on illegal strikes provoked by the government, which is the first to refuse the requests of private individuals and to asphyxiate industry economically by denying it price increases and credits, end quote. On September 10, the Contraloria reaffirmed that the occupation of an enterprise does not authorize, quote, the enactment of unilateral measures such as back-to-work orders for the purpose of establishing state control when such occupation is illegal, end quote. The warning referred to the back-to-work order at the INSA, Tire, and Lilinsa plants. Finally, on September 13, the Contraloria categorically refused to give effect to the requisitioning of and control over several factories, including the Big Rayon Hill and Manufactura Sumar textile mills, and ordered these firms restored to their owners. On September 28, the Contraloria rejected Dirinco's latest decisions to requisition certain fish and textile plants, stating that the reason given by Dirinco to justify such measures did not correspond to the conditions required by law. The government finally decided to requisition the 8 largest textile mills in the country by means of a decree of insistence, so as to allow no appeal. On October 1, Victor Garcia, a National Party senator, denounced the illegal nationalization of a number of companies and banks that the government had bought, confiscated, or brought under its control. Another rightist member of parliament, Mario Arnello, asserted that the decree of insistence used by the government to requisition companies was absolutely illegal. In December 1971, the National Party presented another constitutional indictment against the Minister of Economy, Pedro Vuskovic, stating that, quote, during his entire term as a minister, he has constantly demonstrated arbitrariness, illegality, violation of the Constitution and the law, and abuse and misuse of power, end quote. In the same month, the Society for Industrial Development stated, quote, thus, the nationalization of enterprises by means of a procedure considered illegal by the Contraloria is reinstated and imposed through decrees of insistence, end quote. This referred to the requisitioning of the El Volcán factory by the government. Disregarding the warnings of the Contraloria and the opposition, the government requisitioned the Calaf plant in Talca province and the Fanalosa plant in Penco district, Concepcion province. The Calaf requisitioned was to be rejected by the Contraloria on February 9, 1972. But before that, in January 1972, the courts would join the Contraloria in its work of obstruction. On January 4, the Supreme Court upheld a suit filed by the Yarur textile firm against a Dirinco requisition. On the same day, the courts restored the daily newspaper La Mañana to its owners. The paper had been occupied by its workers, who demanded the government take over the enterprise. On January 18, the Contraloria refused to validate a back-to-work order at the Gasco Company, which had been on strike since January 15. A few days later, the government was forced to order a return to work by means of a decree of insistence. At the end of January, the controller reaffirmed, in regard to this gas manufacturing and distributing company, that, quote, The illegal acts of occupying offices is not sufficient grounds to prove paralysis of activities vital to the national economy, end quote, which condition would have justified the requisition. When it was brought into the government with two ministers at the beginning of 1972, the Radical Left Party published a statement on the attitude the UP government should adopt, stating in part that, quote, "We believe that in no case can labor disputes be used to transfer companies which do not satisfy the conditions required by law into the public or mixed sector." End quote. Failure to respect this demand would later be one of the pretexts used by this party to withdraw from the government and join the opposition at the instigation of the CIA, as the US Senate report on CIA involvement shows. Referring to a decision by the Executive Council of Corfo to allocate funds for the purchase of the shares of 91 companies that the government wanted to nationalize, a spokesman for the Society for Industrial Development stated, quote, "This declaration by Corfo did not surprise us. It shows once again that the government plans to use illegal means to build up the public sector of the economy." End quote. All this pressure was designed to force the government to submit its nationalization plans to Parliament, where the opposition could use its majority to scuttle them. It was for the same purpose that the Christian Democrats later presented their constitutional reform aimed at delimiting the three sectors of the economy. The reform was a key part of the opposition's plan to prove the illegality and illegitimacy of the government and to justify the open appeals for its overthrow by the army. On February 14, 1972, without holding a hearing, the Contraloria rejected Dirinco's decision to requisition the El Volcan plant. The reasons given in the whereases of the Contraloria's ruling were that it could not accept either the legality of the measure or the pretext for it, shortage of vulcanite, gypsum, and insulating material, and that the illegal strike against the company was provoked expressly to bring about its requisition. At the end of February 1972, the leaders of the Society for Industrial Development, SOFOFA, sent a letter to President Allende stating that, quote, "The method of transferring companies using the loophole of an offer to purchase by Corfo and negotiations between Corfo and the shareholders is irrational and intrinsically unjust." End quote. In short, they wanted to deny the government the right enjoyed by any individual to buy the shares of companies registered with the stock exchange. This prohibition, a harsh and unjust restriction on the government's activities, was part of the constitutional reform of the three economic sectors presented by the CDP. Parliament's pressure against the system of requisitions and control intensified in March. The leader of the Christian Democratic Parliamentarians, Luis Barreto, stated, quote, "I believe that the requisitioning of factories, which the constitutional reform stipulates, may only be expropriated by means of a law of the Republic, is a challenge to Congress and an additional demonstration of Mr. Vuskovich's abuse of power and lack of respect," end quote, referring to the Minister of the Economy. Domingo Godoy, a National Party representative, added that, quote, "The President of the Republic has the floor. If he disagrees with the actions of his Secretary of State, the latter should hand in his resignation. Otherwise, one must conclude that he has been overwhelmed by the communists or that he really agrees with the minister's arbitrary policy, despite his statements to the contrary." End quote. Meanwhile, SOFOFA, through its president, Orlando Sáenz, again insisted that, quote, "The government is not following legal and democratic methods for the transfer of factories to the public sector. It is using requisitions with a view to expropriation, and that is illegal." End quote. Carrying on this campaign to create in the public mind the image of illegal activities by the government, which in fact was scrupulously staying within its legal prerogatives, the opposition Radical Democratic Party stated, quote, "While the constitutional reform bill, concerning the three sectors of the economy, is binding on the government, Cabinet Minister Vuskovic is grotesquely ridiculing Parliament by persisting in his attitude of violating the laws, putting the legislative branch in a ridiculous position both nationally and internationally." End quote. The president of the National Confederation of Retail Trade Establishments and Small Industry, Rafael Comsille, one of the ringleaders of the strikes organized by the opposition to overthrow the government, stated, quote, "The transfer of a company to the public sector must be done for really well-founded reasons, by means of specific laws and not by methods unknown in Chile, as the Minister of the Economy personally is doing, trying to make the population believe that the independent workers in industry and commerce are responsible for the critical situation of shortages that the country finds itself in. End quote. In the midst of this public relations offensive to discredit the legal conduct of the government, the Contraloria returned to the attack. On March 17, 1972, it again rejected the requisition of the big Madeco copper refining company. On March 23, without a hearing, it rejected the decision to requisition the Cerecita plant. On April 19, it declared Derinco's decisions to requisition the Cachatun mineral water plant and the non-alcoholic beverage plants of the United Brewers Company to be illegal. At the beginning of May, the Fourth Superior Court of Santiago joined the offensive against the government by rendering a judgment ordering Derinco to restore the requisitioned Rayon Said plant to its owners within 5 days, and to compensate them for damages. The judgment stated that Derinco did not have the authority to requisition factories. For its part, the Insurance and Corporate Supervisory Board published a report stating that the government-appointed administrator at the Calaf plant, quote, is completely incompetent to exercise any function whatsoever, because the order or decision by virtue of which he was appointed has been rejected by the Contraloria, end quote. Stepping up its attack against the government, the Contraloria finally suspended from office the director of Derinco, Patricio Palma, for having failed to reply to 3 official letters demanding that he justify takeovers of enterprises. However, the government continued to use the procedures condemned by the opposition. On June 13, 1972, it used a decree of insistence signed by the president and all his ministers to order a return to work at the FENSA Electrical Appliance Company and to take over the company. The controller immediately reported this to the Supreme Court, because the hearing into the offenses of occupation and violation of the right to work committed at FENSA was still going on at the 7th Superior Criminal Court. Later, the President of the Republic himself asked the Supreme Court that the judge of the 7th Criminal Court cease his judicial activities in regard to FENSA, which were hindering the activities of the government administrator. The Supreme Court unanimously decided to turn down the President's request. The judge conducting the FENSA trial launched proceedings against the administration for having taken charge of the plant when it was at the disposal of the court. On June 26, the government administrator of FENSA was judged guilty of, quote, preventing the execution of a court order, end quote. In early July, the directors of the FENSA plant, encouraged by the judicial support of the Contraloria, launched a suit against ex-minister of the economy, Pedro Vuskovic. Foreseeing a constitutional indictment against him, the government had discreetly relieved Vuskovic of his duties, and against the administrator of the company, quote, for prejudicial acts which, to date, have resulted in losses of 15 million escudos, end quote. Finally, on November 8, without holding a hearing, the Contraloria rejected a Derinco decision attempting to legalize the FENSA requisition. At that time, the opposition press wrote of losses of more than 70 million escudos for the company. On June 29, 1972, the Contraloria attacked the government's plan to establish norms for the operation of the automotive corporation, rejecting an executive order as, quote, not in conformity with the law, end quote. At the beginning of July, after having turned down 2 previous executive orders, the Contraloria launched proceedings against a government decree of insistence aimed at regulating the automotive corporation. At the end of June, the courts ordered the forcible evacuation of the Perlac plant, which had been occupied by workers demanding the takeover of the plant. The following month, the government was forced to use another decree of insistence to requisition a number of factories, which were the subject of constant litigation with their owners. Amongst these were some we have already mentioned: Madeco, Cachantun, Calaf, and 2 United Breweries plants. In October 1972 came the strike in transport, commerce, public transportation, and other employers and professional corporations led by the opposition. These corporations presented a set of demands to the government. One of the demands presented as a condition to end the strike was, quote, restitution of assets that have been requisitioned or taken over with appropriate compensation, end quote. Already putting forward his plan to declare the government illegal and illegitimate, Supreme Court President Enrique Urrutia Manzano in his speech to open the 1973 judicial year, described the decrees of insistence used by the executive as legal loopholes, and stated, quote, because of the various problems posed by social movements in recent years, and with respect to cases which this court has had the opportunity to review, as a result either of complaints or of other proceedings, we have established that there is a sort of inefficacy in the work of verifying the legality of orders issued by the executive, which is the responsibility of the Contraloria. This is due to the fact that the representations made by the Contraloria to the executive are bypassed by a mere decree of insistence issued by the executive itself with the signatures of all the members of the cabinet, who, in general, are of a political nature. Thus, the illegal order ends up being implemented. End quote. In March, a polemic developed between the Contraloria and the Minister of the Economy, following the Contraloria's rejection of a government order requisitioning the Bio Bio cement factory. The minister accused the controller of, quote, constantly changing his views and issuing judgments that tend to weaken the administrative actions of the Rinco, end quote. The controller replied, quote, the political constitution of the state and complementary legislation clearly define the area of jurisdiction of the executive branch and of the Contraloria is to oversee this responsible for the administration of the country, which must be done within the framework of the Constitution and the law. The responsibility of the Contraloria is to oversee this administration, precisely so that it is carried out within the constitutional and legal framework. The Contraloria has a duty to point out actions which go beyond this framework. This is exactly what the Contraloria has done, and what, on this occasion, has drawn the attention of the minister. On the other hand, end quote, he concluded, quote, neither the political constitution nor any law gives the Minister of the Economy, Development, and Reconstruction the power to oversee the acts of the Contraloria, end quote. Despite these problems, the government sent the Contraloria another decree of insistence on April 10, 1973, in order to implement the requisition orders that the Contraloria had rejected. This seems to have been the last decree of insistence before the coup d'etat. All this guerrilla warfare against the government was not waged in an isolated manner. It was coordinated more and more closely with the offensive launched in Parliament, with the courts, which systematically opposed the government on many points besides the requisitioning of companies, with all the activity to develop speculation and shortages, and finally, with a political offensive that went from attacks in the press and large-scale protests to the stoppage of vital activities and violence and sabotage against the vital sectors of the economy. Even during the two big road transport strikes, the Contraloria rejected the government orders requisitioning the means of transportation that had been illegally paralyzed under the pretext that, quote, large-scale requisitions lack specific itemization of the object requisitioned, end quote. It must be borne in mind that the Contraloria had never felt these legalistic scruples under other bourgeois governments. There is no doubt that the reason the Contraloria and other institutions were able to obstruct the government's plans was precisely the ambiguity and feebleness of its reformist politics, which were in contradiction with its ambitious plans to deprive the ruling classes of their means of production. The government's practical actions, for example, inciting factory occupations and labor disputes as pretexts for requisitions, were always feeble and halfway, if not hypocritical. They allowed the opposition, through its instruments of propaganda, to show that the government was inconsistent with respect to the strict legalism it claimed to profess. The government did not create an open, vigorous mass movement to smash the maneuvers of the reactionary circles that were taking advantage of the laws and institutions in their service and under their control, except for a few limited and timid mobilizations designed to serve as pretexts for the use of legal loopholes. On the other hand, the laws and institutions created by the exploiters to serve their interests and manipulated by them were virtually useless as instruments to dispossess them, and as a result, acting within the law, the government was forced to show its weakness by using inadequate and anachronistic decrees and resorting to emergency measures such as decrees of insistence. Thus, at the beginning of the government's term, the Contraloria let a few requisition orders pass without raising any objection, for fear of a real mobilization of the people. But, quote, once the initial moment of surprise and confusion had passed, end quote, as the military junta was to say in its writings against the Allende government, the Contraloria began systematically to turn down their requisition orders and, in conjunction with the courts, to obstruct their implementation.